3 more US police officers charged over the death of George Floyd as protesters continue to defy curfews. Industry welcomes a government cash splash for housing, but the opposition says it's a missed opportunity. Fears runoff from a New South Wales mine could be contaminating a major river system. And a pay dispute looms as Cricket Australia projects a massive plunge in revenue. Hello, welcome to ABC News. I'm Karina Carvalho. All 4 police officers involved in George Floyd's killing have been charged, but it didn't stop protests erupting across the United States for another night. Hundreds of thousands gathered in mostly peaceful protests, with George Floyd's brother returning to the scene of the crime to kneel in silence. Former President Barack Obama also lent his support to the growing movement, urging activists to ensure they turn their anger into change. North America correspondent David Lipson reports from Washington.
Day by day, as the chaos subsides, a movement is growing, led by a new generation of young, peaceful activists. In cities like Los Angeles and Portland, huge crowds are turning out. And it's happening in small towns too. Marches in Crown Point, Indiana showed they'll no longer be intimidated.
Would you stand there watching while I beg for my life?
And the protesters are already seeing results.
What's his name? George Floyd!
These are the 3 officers who stood by as George Floyd slowly died. They're now charged with aiding and abetting murder. And Derek Chauvin, the officer who kneeled on his neck, has had his charge upgraded.
I believe the evidence available to us now supports the stronger charge of second-degree murder.
George Floyd's son returned to the scene of the crime and kneeled in silence. News of the arrests didn't ease his grief.
I am happy that all the officers have been arrested. My father have not been killed like this. We deserve justice. That's all I have to say.
On the protest front lines, the news was welcomed, but no one thinks this fight is over.
George Floyd, that's just a step. You know, there's way more victims out there that need prosecution.
This is not the end of anything. This is the beginning of a lot of things. This is a issue that we've been dealing with for hundreds of years.
Today, it also emerged that George Floyd had tested positive for coronavirus, another crisis hitting African Americans harder. The country's first black president urged protesters to maintain their momentum.
Historically, so much of the progress that we've made in our society has been because of young people.
Barack Obama was elected to power on a promise of change, but at the end of 8 years, America wasn't that different. Well, today, 4 years later, it does start to feel like change is in the air. The question is whether that momentum will hold.
Beyond a cry for justice, the protesters' end goal hasn't yet taken shape. But they're determined to find it together. David Lipson, ABC News, Washington.
As Donald Trump attempts to quell the ongoing protests, he's now facing an unprecedented revolt from some of his country's most senior and trusted military officials. In a stinging rebuke of Trump's behaviour, former Defence Secretary and retired General James Mattis has accused the president of deliberately dividing the country. Other senior officials are speaking out too, with the serving Defence Secretary openly expressing his concern with the deployment of the military on US streets. Zoe Daniel reports.
Donald Trump has flagged using soldiers to enforce the law. But for Defence Secretary Mark Esper, that's a red line that shouldn't be crossed unless it's unavoidable.
The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now.
Amid concerns that the president may try to impose martial law, there are more police, heavily armed and in fatigues on DC's streets. Triggering the 1807 Insurrection Act would give the federal government authority to deploy the military to control civil disorder.
We have to have a dominant force. Maybe it doesn't sound good to say it, but you have to have a dominant force. We need law and order.
The president's rhetoric has provoked a blast from his former Defence Secretary James Mattis, who said Americans must reject any thinking of US cities as a battle space to be dominated by the military. Also expressing disbelief that troops may be ordered to violate the constitutional rights of their fellow citizens.
I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Mattis ultimately left the White House at the end of 2018 after disagreements with the president. He was the last of a trio of generals referred to as the adults in the room, including H.R. McMaster and John Kelly, who eventually left or was sacked by a president who tends to eject dissenters. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a memo to his colleagues to remain true to their oath to defend the Constitution, including freedom of speech and the right to peaceful assembly. Zoe Daniel, ABC News.
The housing industry is reporting a sudden surge in buyer interest now that $700 million in subsidies is being pumped into the building market. The 7-month grant scheme became available as soon as it was launched by the Prime Minister. And although Labor is criticising it, some buyers took advantage of the extra $25,000 immediately. Here's National Affairs correspondent Greg Jennett.
The elbows were out.
Nice to meet you. You too. Thank you.
And in -3 degrees, the hands were too.
Oh, we can't do those high-fiving.
Long enough to dig out almost $700 million.
Well, we're here to tell them that we're going to keep that dream alive for them.
Today's announcement is designed to get our tradies back to work.
The industry had watched orders for new homes and renovations freeze in the isolation period.
We were facing the valley of death towards hundreds of thousands of job losses.
In an economic valley that now has another name.
I really didn't want to see a recession ever again in Australia.
The government assumes its subsidies will kickstart new housing work worth up to $10 billion.
Hey, buddy. Hey.
To get the $25,000, contracts must be signed between today and the end of the year, and only with a licensed builder or contractor. For a new home, up to $750,000, or a major renovation on an existing home. But to be eligible, a couple can earn no more than $200,000 a year, or a single $125,000. There are limits on the value of the properties to be built or worked on. Pools, tennis courts and sheds won't be covered either.
For a lot of tradies, all they're going to be building is a longer line out the front of Centrelink.
The package has set off an early bun rush, but it is limited. Because contracts have to be signed before New Year's Day, anyone who hasn't by now at least given thought to those cumbersome design and council approvals faces an uphill battle to have their project included. Then again, if buyers are ready, as Vivek Agarwal was, to sign up today, the windfall's a bonanza.
It's like a jackpot. You're winning a jackpot of 25 grains.
The same goes for Alex Ball and Alex Rowan.
Pretty ecstatic.
Yeah, pretty excited.
With state first homeowners incentives, they're $40,000 better off and reaching their deposit.
That leads out to the park.
On the Sunshine Coast, that valley of death suddenly sounding lush again.
I'm sure that we'll see a bring forward of demand over the next few weeks.
Come on.
When $700 million's being showered about on housing.
Hey guys, I've just reseeded that.
The green grass of homes, the least to expect.
Make sure you get off that bloke's lawn.
Greg Jennett, ABC News, Canberra.
Australia may have just snuck into a recession on the GDP numbers, but it doesn't tell the full story, and neither does the official unemployment rate. A collapse in work hours is how many Australians are feeling the pain. And some economists are warning the recession could become a depression if the government withdraws its economic stimulus. Stephen Long reports.
Some waterproofing.
Yep, have you got brushes up there?
I'll send the roping up for these.
Jeremy Sims repairs roofs for a living. His partner Anna isn't normally his offsider. She was working full-time as growth and operations manager for a tech startup before COVID-19 hit. She was stood down without pay as the economy slumped into recession. So now you're on the tools?
I'm on the tools. Yes, keeps me busy, keeps me active, which is good. Right, ready?
That's putting a brave face on it. Anna's was the stable income the couple relied on. JobKeeper's only restored some of her hours and income.
How much money are you down at the moment?
More than half my income with the job subsidy. So, you know, still, and that's quite a bit of money when you look at it.
Jeremy still has full-time work, but he's employing fewer people.
Now we're down to just 2 of us, really. So, plus Anna, who helps me, obviously.
Right.
Far more than the headline unemployment rate, a collapse in work hours for the economy shows the extent of the recession we're now in. The Reserve Bank is using the fall in work hours to assess the extent of the downturn. It was expecting a 20% fall in overall hours worked in the economy. Now it's hoping for a mere 15%, which is still shocking.
I'm worried what's going to happen once the JobKeeper, JobSeeker, the banks, all the extra benefits stop. And once it all comes to a halt, what happens then?
Economist Alison Pennington argues that withdrawing the government stimulus would be madness.
We're staring down the barrel of a depression Mark II. The business-led economy that we had coming into this crisis will fail to pull us out of it.
How bad do you think it could get?
Bad enough that I don't want to invest in anything at all.
Government programs are plugging some of the holes for now, but the economy needs long-term repair. Stephen Long, ABC News.
New analysis from Australian scientists has found around 15% of people with coronavirus are asymptomatic. That means they're carriers without having symptoms, and unless they're tested, they won't know they have it. It's why experts are urging Australians to remain vigilant with distancing as the country unwinds restrictions. Here's medical reporter Sophie Scott.
They look at them jumping.
Sydney couple Bev and John Cable can now share a laugh about the bucket list trip that didn't go as planned.
Groundhog Day.
When a crew member became ill, everyone on the ship was confined to cabins and tested for coronavirus.
I've always had a little bit of a weak chest, so I was slightly concerned, but I didn't have any symptoms.
With the ship stranded off Uruguay, the grandparents were stunned to learn they tested positive to the virus.
If we were positive, then it didn't show in any other way than a piece of paper.
Despite both being in their 70s, a high-risk age group for COVID-19, they remained perfectly well, never getting any symptoms at all. Researchers from Bond University now believe about 15% of people who contract COVID-19 will be asymptomatic, like the Cables.
So for every 6 people who develop the infection, that is the COVID-19, about one of those 6, or 1 in 7, will not have any symptoms for the whole of the illness.
They examined 9 overseas studies, totalling around 20,000 asymptomatic coronavirus cases. Fortunately, patients without symptoms were 1/3 less likely to spread the disease.
You're not doing the things like coughing or sneezing because you don't have symptoms.
While the research confirms that only a small number of people are wandering around the community not knowing they have COVID-19, experts warn people can't become complacent.
You go to a restaurant, you go to the gym, you go to a protest, you don't know if the person next to you is infected or not, and they may not know either.
While their trip was one to remember, the Cables haven't been put off. They've already booked another cruise once border restrictions are lifted. Sophie Scott, ABC News.
The World Health Organization will resume testing the controversial drug hydroxychloroquine after doubts emerged over a study which had linked the drug to higher mortality rates. The surprising reversal came after the prestigious British medical journal, The Lancet, issued an expression of concern because of serious scientific questions over that earlier study.
When we announced last week that we were temporarily suspending the enrollment into the hydroxychloroquine trial, it was based on some reports of increased mortality. We are now fairly confident, not having seen any differences in mortality, that the trial can continue.
The recommendation means doctors will soon be able to resume giving the drug to patients enrolled in the UN Health Agency study. More than 40 people have been injured in a knife attack at a primary school in southern China, reportedly by one of the school's security guards. The local government in the region says 37 students and 2 adults suffered injuries in the attack. Chinese state media says the suspect, named only as Li, has been arrested. A convicted German sex offender has been identified as a new suspect in the case of missing British girl Madeleine McCann. Police say the unnamed 43-year-old, who is now in prison, used this camper van to travel around Portugal at the time of her disappearance. Madeleine was 3 years old when she vanished from a holiday resort in 2007.
He used the vehicle to live in, and certainly the week preceding he was in there living, so he would move around the area.
Police also say the suspect transferred his car into someone else's name the day after Madeleine disappeared. Her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, thanked law enforcement officials for their efforts, but say they will never give up hope of finding Madeleine alive. Qantas has announced the first expansion of flights since the pandemic hit, starting to bring more of its staff back on board. Australia's airlines have been on life support, relying on taxpayer money to keep planes in the air. But that money's about to end and some routes may cease without it. Casey Briggs reports.
With fleets grounded, parking's a scarce resource. This runway has been turned into a makeshift open-air hangar. But while greatly reduced, the work of Sydney Airport continues.
It's business as usual for us. We just like to see a few more aircraft moving.
The route between Sydney and Melbourne is normally the second busiest in the world. Before the pandemic, there were around 160 flights between these two cities every day. Fast forward to April, that dropped to just 12. Sydney Airport, our busiest airport, has gone from almost 440 flights a day to 50. Qantas is now putting more planes back in the air. It's increasing flights between Sydney and Melbourne ninefold by the end of the month. But the new flights are still just 15% of usual levels. On a typical Thursday, there'd be more than 2,500 flights in Australian airspace. The moment travel restrictions were imposed, that activity plunged, and the drop only halted when the federal government stepped in to underwrite flights. That's helped keep a skeleton schedule of almost 550 flights a day in the air. That taxpayer money runs out next week, and both Qantas and Virgin are talking to the government about extending it.
Well, everything's on the table and we're reviewing those things at the moment with the airline sector.
Qantas says some of its routes, particularly those affected by travel restrictions, are still commercially unviable. Flights to popular tourist destinations have all but dried up. There were 199 flights to or from Hamilton Island in April 2019. The same period this year, 0. There was just 5% of the usual number of flights to Lord Howe Island, less than 4% for Port Macquarie, and less than 2% of normal flight traffic to Ballina Byron Bay.
The airlines won't be flying unless they're supported to fly, unless passengers are buying tickets.
But passengers can't buy tickets to flights that don't exist. A catch-22 getting in the way of local economic recovery. Casey Briggs, ABC News.
Victims of bushfires should have access to a single person to help with recovery so they don't have to relive the distressing experiences repeatedly. That's the evidence to the Bushfire Royal Commission from the coordinator of the federal relief effort.
What we consider to be a consistent set of... It would be ideal that a victim of a bushfire only ever needs to talk to one person and tell their story once. Because every time they have to tell their story, we're effectively re-traumatising that individual.
The inquiry heard the sheer scale of the fires and the layers of government and services compounded by the coronavirus has restricted the flow of financial aid. So far, half of the $2 billion the federal government set aside for the fire recovery has been spent. From midday tomorrow, Territorians will move into a new phase of eased COVID-19 restrictions. Biosecurity travel bans will lift, and all services and activities with a COVID safety plan can get going again. That means playing team sports, getting a tattoo or beauty service, or enjoying the outdoor cinema.
The moment tattoo artist Mim Dabbs heard she could get back to work was a big one.
I just burst into tears. I was so happy. Happy tears. So happy. So happy. So I'm ecstatic. I can't wait to get back to my job.
She's been making the most of the pandemic downtime, creating artworks of a different kind.
And people would say, do a turtle or do a barra. So I was doing things that I didn't usually do. I painted a surfboard for another customer. She said, I've got a surfboard, do you want to paint that?
But it has been a challenge.
Not having a reopening date, not having an income, it's a really heightened stage of anxiety and distress.
Now the artist is booked up until September and is now prepping for clients who'll arrive from midday tomorrow, when stage 3 of eased restrictions begin in the Territory. Reese Shearer is one of them, keen to get the last bit of work done on a tattoo which was almost complete before the lockdown.
Once you get your first one, then you sort of just want to keep going with it. So, yeah, I don't enjoy the process so much, but yeah, I like the art, I love art and stuff.
And it's not just the tattoo he's looking forward to.
Probably the opening up of Kakadu and yeah, where I can go fishing that have been shut down the last few months, so that's a big one for us.
That will be possible later this month. Although biosecurity restrictions lift for remote communities tomorrow, there'll be a staged opening of Kakadu National Park from the 19th of June. Uluru Katajuta National Park is still in negotiations about its opening date.
This weekend we expect to see people going camping and fishing out of Darwin. We also expect to see people that have been isolated in remote communities to come into town.
And while larger cinemas remain closed for now, Darwin's Deck Chair Cinema is busily preparing for its opening night on Friday. Fewer people will be able to squeeze in with space required between groups, and the weekend is nearly sold out.
So we've been putting floor markings out, so every metre and a half we've been painting little cute owls or possums, the signage so that you understand what the owls and possums mean as well.
All previously restricted services and activities, including team sports and drinking at bars without a meal, can now happen, as long as there's a COVID-19 safety plan in place.
They will be targeting drink drivers.
There is some uncertainty for major events, with crowds of 500 or more. The Darwin Cup and Base in the Grass, for example, are still working on separate plans to manage their crowds, which need to be ticked off by the Health Department. Felicity James, ABC News.
2 teenage girls have been charged with murder less than a fortnight after a 19-year-old man fell to his death from a Gold Coast balcony. Police have alleged Keen English was trying to flee a knife-point robbery and torture when he fell from the 4th floor of the Surfers Paradise apartment block. The incident was allegedly filmed by the girls and posted on social media.
With murder charges laid on 2 teens over Keen English's untimely death, police have made an impassioned plea.
I know if my daughter was, when she was 16, if she wasn't at home, I'd be asking the questions, where the hell is she? Why aren't parents doing that today?
The 19-year-old was partying on the Gold Coast with mates when police say another group invited him and others upstairs to their unit. Sometime later, police allege Keen and his friend were tortured for half an hour. Police claim
they've been robbed at knife point, they've been assaulted, they've been attacked on a number of occasions, unable to escape the surroundings.
Another friend lay unconscious on the balcony. The 16-year-old Gold Coast girls, who can't be identified, allegedly filmed it all and posted the attack on social media. As Keen tried to escape, police say he fell to his death. His body had 2 knife wounds to his arm and chin. He was found by a passerby, but police say the group knew of his fate.
We'll be alleging that they've seen him go over the veranda, they've looked down and saw him obviously deceased, and then they've stolen clothing off this unconscious male on the veranda.
3 young men aged 18, 20 and 22 have already been charged. The teenage girls were due to appear in the Southport Children's Court today. Police say they don't expect to lay any further charges over Keen English's death, but they have made a broad appeal to young people, urging them to pull their mates into line when they start to boast about violence and weapons.
For some reason, they think it's cool to have that gangster mindset, and they've got to carry on off to be cool. It takes other kids to go, hey, don't do this, you're an idiot.
Tim Swanston, ABC News, Brisbane.
Police are investigating a spiritual healing scam targeting women in Melbourne's Russian community. 2 women have lost tens of thousands of dollars after handing over valuables to women who claimed they could heal them. Police believe there may be more victims.
Inga was at a shopping centre in February when she says an older woman approached her, speaking in Russian.
he hold my hand. He start to say, oh, you have something problem, you have something bad, and hold my two hands and look in my eyes.
Inga was persuaded to drive home and return to the shopping centre with all her valuables, cash and jewellery, wrapped in a scarf. Then, in full view of other shoppers, the scarf containing Inga's valuables was swapped for a pile of stones during a prayer session.
It's very wrong. It's targeting people during already difficult times and stealing and taking all their valuables.
Because I believe people. It's my problem. I don't believe it has been happened.
Police have released this vision of 3 women they want to speak to about Inga's case and about a similar case in St Kilda 3 days later. Police say the group is targeting women in Melbourne's Russian community, approaching them on the streets and in shopping centres. And it's likely there are more victims.
It's not something to be embarrassed about. We want to be able to help you, and we also want to hold these women to account.
Anyone with information is being urged to contact police. Margaret Paul, ABC News, Melbourne.
The Queensland coroner has recommended adoption should be genuinely considered as an option for children in out-of-home care. It's part of the findings into the death of Caboolture toddler Mason Jet Lee. But some child protection groups say adoption is a drastic measure that's only appropriate in very few cases.
The death of Mason Jet Lee horrified a community and shone a light on the failings of the Child Safety Department. In delivering her findings into the handling of his case, Deputy State Coroner Jane Bentley took aim at the system. Despite successive governments providing ever-increasing amounts of funding for the child protection system, it continues to be overwhelmed. One of her key recommendations, that adoption be routinely and genuinely considered when deciding where to place a child in out-of-home care. But it's a contentious issue that has those on the front line divided.
If there are no parents or family members willing or able to care for children, then permanency options such as adoption should be seriously considered, especially for very young children.
Whilst it's a suitable option for a small number of children, there are other options available that achieve the goal of achieving stability.
Miss Bentley's call echoes that made during the Carmody inquiry in 2013, a recommendation accepted by the then LNP government, but she said it hadn't been implemented in any real sense. In her report, Miss Bentley highlights that between 2013 and 2019, just a tiny handful of children have been adopted from out-of-home care, with 32 permanent orders made since October 2018. That's compared with almost 7,000 children under the care of the department.
Adoption isn't simply about separating a child from its parents. It's also about the separation that occurs from their family members, grandparents, aunties, uncles, and very, very importantly, their brothers and sisters.
While parents should be given the option, the rights of children to be safe and cared for can't come second.
Indigenous groups are particularly opposed to adoption.
There are much more productive and less damaging ways to work with families and to keep children safe in Queensland.
The state government is considering the recommendations. Ashley Stevenson, ABC News, Brisbane.
Researchers are worried about pollution from a coal mine running into a major river system in southwest Sydney. The waterway provides drinking water for residents many kilometres away, and the mine operator is trying to get an extension to its licence.
Dirty, turbid water pours into a clean Bargo River in April. It's runoff from the Tarmore coal mine and heading downstream through a popular swimming spot, Mermaid's Pool, and onwards.
It is full of algae, full of a cocktail of metals, including arsenic, and one of them is uranium.
These bright green algae blooms were found by the Western Sydney University researchers further south, where the Bargo meets the Nepean River. It's a major Sydney waterway with many places to swim and part of a system that supplies drinking water many kilometres away.
It's such an important tributary to one of Australia's most important rivers. And there's a major pollution problem with a mine using that as a drain.
It's a long and difficult trek to get to where the two rivers meet, but these researchers have been making the journey to test how much pollution is coming from the Tarmore mine, the same colliery which is having an application to extend its mining operations considered by the state government.
I am concerned that this is going to get rushed through the planning system.
The Tahmoor mine says its water is monitored and treated in accordance with its environmental protection licence conditions, and that runoff is usually cleaner than mandated limits. It also added that it's planning to build a new water treatment plant on site. The Environmental Protection Authority says it's investigating discharge filmed in April, and it says after discussions, the mine has made changes on site to improve water quality. Jonathan Hare, ABC News, Sydney.
You can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on iView. Here are the top stories on ABC News. Thousands of people across the United States have defied curfews for another night to protest against police brutality. The demonstrations were sparked by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis at the hands of police. All officers involved have now been charged. The federal government has unveiled its home builder package, hoping to supply work for the residential construction sector. To boost demand, $25,000 grants will be offered for renovation projects and new home builds. But the opposition is criticising the scheme because people will need to spend at least $150,000 of their own money to be eligible for the grant. Police say mobile phone footage led to the arrest of two teenage girls almost a fortnight after a man fell to his death from a balcony on the Gold Coast. The pair has been charged with murder, torture and other offences over the death of 19-year-old Keen English. Police believe he was trying to escape a violent robbery when he fell from a fourth-floor unit at Surfers Paradise. And Cricket Australia has a fight on its hands with the players rejecting forecasts. The game is set to lose hundreds of millions of dollars because of the coronavirus pandemic. The Australian Cricketers Association says it will now enter a dispute resolution process, hoping to shine a light on the financial projections. Thousands of people have rallied across the US for the 9th day, protesting against the death of George Floyd. Former Australian Army officer and now resident fellow at the US Studies Centre, James Brown, says American leaders are facing mounting pressure to show strength in the country's democracy.
Well, it's hard to watch what's happening in the United States and not be disappointed and concerned about its downward trajectory and the apparent loss of its strength and power. I mean, June 4th is the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. It's a day when democracy is under threat in Hong Kong. It's a day when Australia, as an ally and friend of the United States, would want to see US leaders pursuing democracy and showing the strength of democracy. And instead, we're seeing a president threatening to deploy the military on a large-scale basis in his own cities. We're seeing references to dominating the battle space of American neighbourhoods, and we're seeing the president's own Secretary of Defence decry his position and his former Secretary of Defence denounce his abilities to lead the country. And that's before we even get to the fact that 75 US cities are aflame and more than 100,000 Americans have died from the pandemic. So it's hard not to look at it as a friend and as someone who served with American soldiers and think that this looks like the end days of an empire. Most of the times that we can recall fracturing of an administration have happened in the last 3 years. We've seen a number of senior officials and senior leaders fall out with the president. Mostly they've done so quietly. In some cases, they've made some pointed criticisms. Mattis's denouncement of the president today is significant. He's been quiet. He left the office in a dignified way. His resignation letter didn't make a full-throated criticism of the president. He's chosen to do that now and quite deliberately. But unless the president's colleagues in the Senate or the rest of the president's cabinet join in those criticisms, Mattis's statement won't have a huge degree of significance. The president wants to present himself as a man of action and a man of strength. His base would be appalled by the fact that businesses are being looted, that livelihoods are being destroyed, that police are not in control in some cities or haven't been in control at moments in some cities. They'd want to see law and order back on the streets, and they'd want to see a president deaf to political correctness taking authentic and immediate action. But the president's apparent show of strength when he walked across Lafayette Park, I think, really was a hollow show of strength. To do that, to walk 200 metres from his own front door, he needed a company of military police to, in addition to his normal Secret Service detail,
and it required the Attorney General, the highest law official in the land, to order police to clear out non-violent protesters, to use chemical spray, to use tear gas, and some of them to assault journalists. So it's, I think, a very pivotal moment in Trump's presidency. I think they need to get their own domestic situation under control to the extent that the advisors around the president, particularly Vice President Mike Pence, I think what he has to say and what he does will be really important. He chose not to accompany the president for that photo op, and I think that was an important decision for him. But to the extent that they can calm the president down, try and get him to temper his instincts, and that won't be easy, that will help them walk a more united path through the current crisis. But I think most people would be hoping for more authoritative leadership and more stable and more mature leadership in the United States after the election in November.
Thousands of people have marched in London against police violence and racial injustice after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Some clashes erupted between police and demonstrators as they moved through the British capital, blocking traffic. The protest was organised by the Black Lives Matter group.
Black lives have always mattered. We have always been important. We have always meant something. We have always succeeded.
2 Australian journalists were attacked on air while covering the demonstrations. They weren't injured. Reported incidents of domestic violence have increased by 4.1% across New South Wales over the past 2 years. However, there doesn't appear to have been a significant increase in domestic violence during the coronavirus lockdown. For more, I'm joined by Jackie Fitzgerald, who's the Executive Director at the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. Jackie Fitzgerald, thanks for your time tonight. An increase in domestic violence over the last 2 years. What do you put that down to?
Look, we're seeing actually quite wide-ranging increases in domestic violence, unfortunately. So the increases we're seeing are not limited to any particular geography or particular type of domestic violence. So we're seeing increases in intimate partner violence and family violence. We're seeing large increases in the country and also large increases in some parts of Sydney, while we've got large increases amongst juveniles. We've also got increases amongst adults. So there's no one particular type of domestic violence that we're seeing is driving that increase. It seems to be a general rise in that type of offence in terms of the figures that are coming to the police attention.
Sure. So could that be put down to more people reporting incidents?
Look, absolutely it could. So that's one of the things we never really know with domestic violence. An increase in proactive policing or I guess people feeling comfortable reporting to authorities will drive those formal reports up. And we have certainly seen an increase in police effort over the last 5 years in terms of their proactivity in responding to domestic violence. And we can see that they're conducting many more apprehended violence audit checks where they're actually visiting homes and talking to victims and offenders, and I guess prosecuting people for breaching our apprehended violence orders and also prosecuting people for intimidation type offences. So I guess the precursors to physical violence, and we're seeing large increases there. So there absolutely has been an increase in enforcement activity. And also, I guess, in the general community, we're seeing much more discussion about domestic violence. So all of those things could certainly lead to an increased comfort in reporting and bringing in the authorities. But we can't be sure. It's always a risk that we are seeing that what we're reporting is a higher prevalence. And I guess we just want to be mindful of that.
What did you find in regional areas?
So unfortunately, regional areas typically do have higher rates of domestic violence than in the cities, and that's continuing. And the regions in New South Wales are increasing. There's more of them that are increasing, and they're increasing at a greater rate. So we've got 14 statistical areas in New South Wales, and 8 of those are showing increases in domestic violence in the last 2 years. So that's really alarming. I guess the 2 areas with the largest increases, though, were in Sydney, and those were Baulkham Hills and the Hawkesbury and the Sutherland Shire. And they both saw increases of over 30% in domestic violence, and that's kind of an extraordinary increase, really. So extremely large, larger than anywhere else.
Family violence charities have noted a big increase in demand for their services since the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown that ensued. What do the numbers show?
Look, we also were anticipating an increase in domestic violence. It does make sense that people are exposed to their domestic situation for a much longer time than usual at the present, or it's starting to abate now. But so we've been keeping a close eye on this and looking at the police recorded assaults, the police dispatches to urgent incidents, and also DV hotline figures and reports to the DV hotlines. And actually throughout the second half of March and all the way through April, we haven't seen any indication of a rise. So it's quite interesting to note that the figures are very stable, really looking quite similar to 2019 figures. So even though we're reporting a general rise in domestic violence over the 2 years, we haven't seen anything to indicate an increase over the last 6 weeks. And that's looking at various different data sources. We're also looking at the most serious types of domestic violence, so domestic violence murders and domestic violence malicious damage to property, grievous bodily harm incidents. So we consider that these will always come to police attention, and we haven't seen any increases there. So it's still possible that there has been an increase in people's homes and it's just not being reported. But in terms of the official data, and that's very widespread data, wide-ranging data, there's no evidence that with that anticipated increase has occurred.
Because one of, I guess, the higher profile cases that we saw just a few weeks ago was in Western Sydney, a 27-year-old Kamaljeet Sidhu allegedly murdered by her husband despite taking out an AVO against him. They were still living together because of the coronavirus lockdown. You haven't seen a rise in those kind of incidents. So what do you put it down to, given that the agencies are saying that they've seen an increase in demand for their services?
Look, it's interesting, and I guess we also anticipated that rise. If we haven't seen a rise, I think there are some reasons why that's the way it's panned out. Some of the triggers for domestic violence, it could be that those are just not apparent at the moment. So situations where people are socialising, people are coming into contact with ex-partners, people are, I guess, having entertaining, drinking, those kind of scenarios have kind of been taken off the table at the moment. So absolutely, we see most of our domestic violence in the home, but we do see domestic violence rise over those summer months when people are going out and socialising, and all of that is not happening at the moment. So some of those behaviours or patterns that I guess are the precursors to domestic violence, it might be that they're just not, that those scenarios aren't occurring. So as a result, the domestic violence or the serious physical assault certainly isn't occurring. But, it's still, I guess, early days. We want to monitor those figures through into May. And I guess I wouldn't be surprised if we have seen stable patterns throughout the lockdown. I think we're probably going to see a return to normal quite soon. I wouldn't expect any, I guess, any change in the pattern to last long once we reopen communities.
Okay, Jackie Fitzgerald, really interesting to talk through the numbers with you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
If you were planning a quick trip to the New South Wales Snowy Mountains this long weekend, you may as well forget about it. The big 3 ski resorts will all be closed. They're still locked down to prevent any chance of a coronavirus outbreak before the official ski season begins later this month. But the cautious approach has disappointed some local businesses desperate to start earning tourism dollars.
The long weekend is in sight, so is the snow. But coronavirus means the ski fields will be off limits.
The concern is, and we've been talking to the emergency services, which includes also the local medicos, they're not prepared. We're not ready yet for a large influx of people.
To minimise a potential outbreak, the start of the season has been delayed until June 22nd. To keep people away this long weekend, from Friday night, road closures will be in place, and all 3 resorts Perisher, Charlotte Pass and Thredbo will be closed.
I think it's inevitable that it had to be done in view of a couple of weeks ago where a lot of people came up when there was a bit of snow and snow play and all that sort of thing. And it's a bit hard to social distance.
It's hoped the closure will give resorts and businesses time to enact COVID-safe measures.
Roadblocks will be used to stop people accessing parts of Kosciuszko National Park, and there'll be regular patrols to make sure there's no snow play or tobogganing.
If, for example, there was a COVID outbreak, that would put the system under huge stress and has the potential to not allow a ski season to go ahead.
If the season doesn't open and people don't come down, we don't get the tourism, and the amount of small businesses in this area that rely on it, people could lose their businesses.
Some businesses are disappointed they'll be missing out on the tourist dollar.
So obviously it's not ideal. We would love nothing more than to be open for the long weekend.
For those dreaming of a white winter getaway, it's only 18 sleeps until the ski season officially begins. Adrian Reardon, ABC News, Perisher Valley.
To news just in, Hong Kong's Legislative Council has passed a controversial national anthem bill that makes disrespecting China's national anthem a criminal offence. Critics say the move is the latest sign of Beijing's tightening grip on the city. The ruling comes as people in Hong Kong are set to commemorate the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre by lighting candles across the city. Authorities have cancelled the candlelight vigil for the first time in 30 years, citing coronavirus concerns. Hopes for a tourism bubble between Canberra and Wellington appear to have burst, with business leaders being told it's just too soon. Canberra Airport was so confident it had begun taking registrations for a July 1 takeoff, even with no airline locked in. But the plan has effectively been grounded by political leaders here and across the Tasman.
The warrior, Willem!
Isaac Cotter's Kiwi Cultural Group is itching to get back over the ditch.
You just need to go back and and see family and friends and especially ones that aren't well, and some have passed away.
And today, the first ray of hope with an ambitious business-backed plan to restart Trans-Tasman travel as early as July.
Canberra and Wellington have been COVID-free for a long time. We've got small, clean terminals.
It's thought an intercapital shuttle is the perfect test case and could help prise open other state airports.
Australian businesses, New Zealand businesses, we need to get up and get going again.
Hundreds of Canberrans have already registered their interest.
There's a 99% chance that they will proceed, and it's going to be great news for Canberra, great news for Wellington, great news for Australia.
But convincing political leaders and their health advisors on both sides of the Tasman may take many more months, particularly with state borders still shut and a domestic airline industry still crippled.
We've got a long way to go here. And one of the things we're careful to do is not get too far ahead of ourselves.
It's just too early. It doesn't have the support of the Australian government at this point in time. Just as an aside, I wouldn't have thought Wellington and Canberra are the two best places to open up this flight, but never mind. I've got nothing against Canberra.
But Isaac Cotter has a clear message for this Trans-Tasman political alliance.
Which means open all the doors.
But the land of the long white cloud may stay out of reach, at least for now. Craig Allen, ABC News, Canberra.
After a tough few years fighting drought and then bushfires, Victoria's farmers have often had to lean on the generosity of the community to help them get by. Now they want to give something back, with many Victorians struggling to make ends meet because of the impact of COVID-19 restrictions. The state's primary producers have stepped in to offer their assistance.
Bendigo farmer Brendan Williams understands what it's like to do it tough.
Farmers are used to dealing with droughts, and they're great at helping other farmers. So farmers helping farmers is what we do.
But after leaning on Australians to help them through the drought, farmers are now looking to return the favour.
The boot's on the other foot. You know, these people in the towns and the cities are really hurting, and I think it's important that we step up.
When Mr Williams saw long queues at Bendigo's Centrelink office at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, he knew it was time to give back. He's donated 10,000 kilograms of chickpeas to help produce more than 200,000 meals for those in need.
We could sell it, but realistically, I think this is the time where, we need to show the community that, we care, and so we're happy to donate it.
And across the state, others are joining the cause.
At the moment, there's 10,000 kilograms of fresh fruit and vegetables that are being boxed up. But Bendigo Food Share hopes there's more to come in the coming months.
Going into winter, we know electricity costs are skyrocketing. People don't have the amount of employment. People may feel really insecure with their jobs at the moment. And being able to access a meal, being able to access a bag of groceries, hopefully will just take a bit of that stress off them.
It's really excellent that the farmers that are in that local community are supporting that local community. So setting up those hubs all the way around the state and even across the country.
The farmers involved hope it's a start of something special.
COVID-19, I think, has been the genesis of all of this, but I think it is only the genesis. I think we can expand on it going forward.
A labour of love in a time of need. Eden Hennanen, ABC News, Bendigo.
To finance, the local share market had its fourth consecutive rise today, but the Australian dollar slipped back. Here's Alan Kohler.
Well, the share market has risen by an average of 1% a day this week, which is pretty remarkable considering we learnt yesterday that the country is in recession, and the day before the Reserve Bank Governor said it's the biggest economic contraction since the 1930s. And apart from that, the world is falling apart. Today's gains were led by shopping centres like Unibail, Rodamco, Westfield, and travel companies like Qantas and Flight Centre, because investors are focused on the future reopening of the economy rather than past closures. And on one measure, restaurant bookings, Australia is setting the global pace behind Germany. In more sobering news, we got some retail sales data for April today, down 17.7% from the 8.5% increase in March. But within that, clothing and footwear sales fell 50%. And here's the reason building companies have been pleading for help, which the government gave them today with the $25,000 grants. New construction orders have fallen by more than 50%. The rise in our market today followed a fourth consecutive day of gains in the United States, where investors are apparently unconcerned about the riots. But it's worth noting again that it's all focused on 6 companies: Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Netflix and Microsoft. Those stocks have passed their previous peak, and since the start of last year are up 70%, while the rest of the US market is up only 15%, and the rest of the world is barely up at all. Finally, the Australian dollar has slipped back below 69 US cents. And that's finance.
Cricket Australia has a fight on its hands, with the players rejecting forecasts the game is set to lose hundreds of millions of dollars because of the coronavirus. The Australian Cricketers Association has written to the players saying it has no confidence in Cricket Australia's figures. Its analysis shows Cricket Australia is expecting revenue to fall by 48% this year and 20% next year. But the association says the outlook for the game is positive, with India likely to tour later this year and Cricket Australia planning for a full summer. The association says it will now enter a formal dispute resolution process with Cricket Australia to shine a light on the financial forecasts. The NRL has banned betting on this year's Dally M Awards after 2 men were charged over a betting scandal. The 28 and 31-year-olds are accused of sharing inside information about last year's Coach of the Year award before it was announced. The Melbourne Storm's Craig Bellamy took out the accolade. Last week, police raided 2 homes and a business in Sydney and seized documents, computers and other electronic devices. The pair will face court in August. Souths will be trying to improve their poor record in Melbourne when they meet the Storm in round 4 of the NRL tomorrow night. The Rabbitohs are yet to beat the Storm in Melbourne after 15 attempts. Souths coach Wayne Bennett says the absence of Storm fans at the game doesn't improve his team's hopes of a breakthrough win.
Well, the best chance we've got is us going down there and playing well. That's our best chance, whether we've got crowds or not. I don't think the players have really noticed that as much as you might think. They get out there, they train every day without any crowds.
Sydney Roosters fullback James Tedesco has been ruled out of tonight's game against the Broncos in Brisbane after recording a high temperature. The Dally M medalist woke up with a fever and didn't travel to Brisbane. Time for a check of the weather with Graham Creed.
A high-pressure system is the dominant feature across most of the continent. It's keeping the atmosphere very stable, and that means for most areas we are looking at dry conditions. Being to the north of the high-pressure system, though, the coast of Queensland is looking at a slightly moister onshore wind flow. This is going to trigger the potential of some isolated coastal showers. Now, mostly about the exposed coastal areas and a little bit more likely up around the tropical coast anywhere north of about Mackay. New South Wales should remain mostly dry. It's just up around the northern rivers. We could see an isolated coastal shower. Fairly widespread frost across much of the state as we move into the morning. We're also looking at some frost on and north of the ranges in Victoria. It won't be quite as cold through the south. We'll see some cloud developing in the southwest and then a possible shower developing late in the day. As a front moves through Tasmania, showers will become widespread, particularly through the western and southern half of the state. They'll be patchier and lighter about the north and northeast. We've also got some early frost in South Australia. Cloud will build about the lower southeast, and there could just be an isolated coastal shower as that frontal system moves in. Also just an isolated coastal shower about the far southern coast of Western Australia. Elsewhere it should remain clear and dry. Similar scenario for the Territory, clear, dry and mostly sunny. Just an isolated shower about the northeast corner.
Remember, you can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on iView. That's ABC News for now. Coming up on the ABC News channel, more on our top stories. Stay with us.
Know the story, anytime, anywhere with the new ABC News app, making it easier for you to stay up to date while you're on the go. Download the app.
Across endless roads, chasing an endless horizon.
What a country we live in.
Backroads returns in a brand new